So we're using the car forms to search for the document. You simply type HOA, and the first document we're going to look at is Homeowners Association Information Request. This is the form that you're going to use to request information from the HOA. HOA is not required to provide you with any documents unless you make the request. If you make the request, by law, they are required to give you the documents that are requested within 10 calendar days of your request. So if you have a listing that involves a condominium, it behooves you to make the request early. The earlier that you make the request, the better it is. Because you do not have to wait until you receive the first offer to make the request. You can make the request as soon as your listing agreement is signed. The reason why you want to do it as soon as possible because you don't know what kind of delay you're going to get from the HOA. You want everything to be smooth. You want everything to be without problems. So the minute you get your listing agreement signed, you may complete this form. It's called the Homeowners Association Information Request. You put in the address. Okay, so the system gave me the information. Property address, and then owner of property. So you just basically put your seller's information here, wherever your seller's names are. And then for the owner's mailing address, if the owner does not live there, chances are their address is different from the property address. So please go ahead and put a different address here if the mailing address is different from the property address. And then it says here pursuant to California Civil Code 4525 and 4530 and the request of seller. Upon receipt of this request, please provide on forms HOA2 and HOA3 an estimate of fees that will be assessed for providing the requested documents. And 2, within 10 calendar days from the date of this request, please provide to seller the items or information listed on HOA2 and HOA3 at the mailing address indicated above, or to a different address. For example, if it's the listing agent that is requesting it, sometimes instead of mailing the information to the listing agent, the seller has the option of having the documents provided to the listing agent. That can be arranged, okay? And then the person signing this form can be either the seller or the listing agent. HOA2 and HOA3 are just two separate forms. You will see them later on. It says here the documents and information provided by the HOA reference above were provided by. So below it is the information of the party that provides the HOA documents. And the HOA documents can be provided by the association, or it can be provided by the management company. Sometimes you have association that is too small. You don't have a property manager. It's probably one of the homeowners that's responding to this request. However, if it's a larger complex, then chances are this information will be provided by the property management company. Okay, so they will fill out this portion. You fill out the top portion, and they fill out the bottom portion. And then it says here, by signing below, the undersigned acknowledge that each has read, understands, has received a copy of this request. So the seller would just sign here. So this is a copy of the request. And that's the form that you want to use when you make that request. Over here, we have two other forms. We have the charges for required HOA documents, and then we have charges for non-statutory HOA documents. The difference between the two is that the required ones are required by the law. And then the non-statutory, they are not required by the law. However, the buyer may want certain things to evaluate whether to buy the condominium. So you got two different forms to fill out, one for required, one for non-required. Let's look at the required one. This form is known as the HOA2 document. The other form is known as the HOA3 document. And the HOA2 document is pretty much mandatory if you are doing a transaction that involves a condominium. Okay, so you know you have to use this document. In fact, the format on this form is what the law requires you to do. This is actually provided by the law. The law says use this format. That's why this format is being used. It says here, you have the property address, the owner's property, property address, and then the owner's name, and then the owner's mailing address. Exactly like the one that we did for HOA1. Okay. Says here the seller may, in accordance with section 4530 of the Civil Code, provide to the prospective purchaser at no cost current copies of any document specified by section 4525 that are in the possession of the seller. So there are certain documents that are required by law to be provided to the buyer. There are 10 categories. We will be going through each category today. If the seller has all of the documents, then the sellers can provide them to the buyer without charge. But I can tell you though, that is highly unlikely. In fact, I've never seen the seller having all of the documents. No way the seller is going to have it, all of it. So you know it will not involve entirely the seller. You have to involve the HOA or the property manager. Here. And then you will need to provide the provider's name. So if it's the HOA association that's providing it, you put the association's name. If it's association that's doing it, then chances are it's the president name that's going to be mentioned. However, if it's a property manager for the association, most likely you will say agent right here. And then it has the name, the date of the completion. First category is called the Articles of Incorporation. That is mandatory. Now, this information here is actually filled in by the association or the property manager. Whatever fees that they charge, they will put it here. And then it will say yes, not available, not applicable, or directly provided by the seller. If the seller directly provides it, more likely than not, the cost is zero. If it's provided by the association, then there should be a fee over here, most likely. And then you will say yes. Okay. I don't know how much that is. It's up to the association. And the second, and this is category number 1, 4525A1, CC&Rs. That's also required by law to be given to the purchaser. Bylaws may or may not be available. Not every association has bylaw. If it's not available, you put not available. If it's available and you're providing, you check yes. Operating rules and regulations. If it's a small condo, it may not be available, so you put not available. But if it is available, you're attaching it, you check yes. Okay? Age restrictions, if any. This is category number 2. I told you there are 10 categories. We only had number 2. The first 3 documents here, this is what we call the governing documents. These are the documents that are important to how the association is run. Actually, there are 4 of them right here. The second category is called the age restrictions, if any. If it's a senior housing, it's not included in 2. The age restriction has nothing to do with senior housing. It has something to do with age requirement that is beyond the senior housing requirements. If it's just the regular senior housing requirement, number 2 does not apply. It would simply say not apply. Okay? I think if it's a senior housing, you know, this one will say not apply because, you know, it only talks about age restrictions that have nothing to do with senior housing. Senior housing will have its own certain rules. This has nothing to do with senior housing rules. Category number 3 has to do with the annual budget report or summary, including reserve study. Every condominium association must prepare an annual budget report. What is a budget? A budget will set forth all the things that are related to the expenditures of the condominium. And that's the budget. On top of the budget, association must also have a summary that includes the reserve study. They need to figure out how much reserve do they need to repair the roof. How old is the roof? What do they need to have as reserve? So there should be a study conducted, and there should be a report on that. If it's available, chances are it is available, and that's category number 3. Okay? Say yes, or sometimes, you know, they say it's not available, then it's not available. Okay. Next, category number 4, assessment and reserve funding disclosure summary. Reserve study is different from reserve funding disclosure. That was just study. Reserve funding disclosure basically tells the purchaser where the money that is being used as reserve is coming from. Assessment has to do with the monthly assessment, which is what we call the general assessment, and also has to do with special assessment. The special assessment is not the general assessment. It is for certain situation. A special assessment might be due to unanticipated expenses, something that is beyond anticipation. We call that the special assessment. So whether it's general or special, it's included in the assessment summary. But that is just the summary though, okay? So that's category number 4. Sometimes they may not have it. Next is financial statement review. That is number 3. This one goes along with the annual budget report. It's just a financial statement of the association. Next is the assessment enforcement policy. What that means is that what does the association do to enforce the assessment? In case somebody doesn't pay the assessment, what is the policy of the association? Do they allow grace period? How much time do they allow the property owner? Those kind of policy. Category number 3. That also has to do with the insurance summary. What kind of insurance does the association have? It's in summary form. Do they have flood? Do they have fire? Liability? Things like that. Next, it's called the special assessment. Number 4, it's a special assessment. It's not a regular assessment. And that is actually part of this one, number 4. This is all in the same category. And then emergency assessment. Emergency assessment is when there's an emergency that arose that was not anticipated, that requires extra funds to be collected from the individual homeowners. That's called the emergency assessment. Category number 4, other unpaid obligation of seller. If the seller owes the association money, that is the seller's obligation that is not paid, that is not technically assessments, it will be under this category. The next one is called the approved changes to assessments. It's under 4 and 8. Let me tell you what approved changes to assessment means. Say, for example, currently the association, the assessment is $350. However, the board of directors or the homeowners have voted to increase the assessment to $380, which is to be effective on April 1st, 2018. And when the property is in escrow, these changes to the assessment from $350 to $280 must be disclosed to the buyer. So if you are a buyer, you can anticipate that you might receive information like that during the escrow. If there was a vote to increase the assessment, it must be disclosed to the buyer. Okay? It is called the approved changes to assessments. Approved but not implemented yet. Right? So it's under 4 and 8. Next one is called the settlement notice regarding common area defects. Who is responsible for maintenance of the common area in a condominium? It's the HOA. So if you have construction defect in a common area. Structure is a common area. Roof is a common area. So if you have a defective roof, that's the association's problem. And if the association sues the developer and they reach a settlement agreement, then there may be notice of settlement regarding common area defects. If you see a notice of settlement in the preliminary title report, do not be alarmed. All that means is they are required by law to tell the purchaser of any settlement they have reached with the developer for the repair of any defects in a common area. It doesn't mean that if you see the settlement notice, your buyer, you should decide not to buy this condominium. But that's totally up to the buyer now. How comfortable the buyer is to continue to buy the condominium is the buyer's choice. The information must be provided to the buyer. Whether the buyer chooses to continue or not, that's totally up to the buyer. But it must be disclosed to the buyer. So that's number 7. Preliminary list of defects. That's number 6. This one means that the association has learned of certain defects in a common area, has compiled a list of these defects, but have not settled the repair dispute with the developer yet. It is just a list. This list must be provided to the buyer during escrow, and that's under number 6. Notices of violation. If the homeowner has violated certain conditions in the CC&R or certain covenants in the CC&R, homeowners may have received a notice to cure the violation, and that's under number 5. Say, for example, the homeowner had built something in the backyard that is not approved by the association. That is a violation. It must be corrected. And this type of notices must be disclosed to the purchaser during escrow. Next, required statement of fees, 4525. Now, if the association has established fee schedule, they must disclose it to the purchaser. What are the different fees that they charge for preparing the different types of HOA documents? Next, rental restriction. That is number 9. Rental restriction could be something like in the first year, if you are the property owner, you are prohibited from renting the place until you have lived there for at least 1 year, then you can rent it. This is the typical rental restriction that we see, okay? That's number 9. You know, in the past, I have clients that come to see me. They bought a condominium, and now the HOA is finding fault with them, saying that, wait, didn't you know that CC&R says you are not supposed to rent during the first year? And then the buyer is kind of like, oh, I didn't know. My realtor and I did not read the CC&R. Well, what does that tell you? Isn't it the association's obligation to disclose it about rental restriction, if any? Yes. Now, what happened if it was disclosed to you, you just did not bother to read the documents? Then it is the buyer's fault. The association has a right to enforce it against you. Now, what about if it is the association's fault? they did not tell you about the rental restriction, even though it's in the CC&R, can they say, well, can't you read the CC&R? No, they can't, because you know why? They have an obligation to disclose to you if there was a rental restriction. So when you get a notice from the association regarding illegally renting out your unit, first of all, you find out if they did disclose to you or they did not disclose to you that there was a rental restriction. If they did disclose to you, then it's the buyer's fault. If they did not disclose to you, then you have a defense against the association. You basically say, well, weren't you supposed to tell me if there was any rental restriction? I know it's in the CC&R, but you was also supposed to tell me that there was a rental restriction. Then you have a defense against the association. Last one is called the minutes of regular board meetings conducted over the previous 12 months, if requested. So if it's not requested by the buyer, if the buyer did not bother to request the board meeting minutes, they are not required to provide to you. So there will be no number 10. So if you go through all the numbers, I think we covered all 10 items that are required by statute. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? We got 5, we got 7, we got 8, we got 6, we got 9, we got 10. So we got all 10 items on this mandatory requirement. All right, if you have a question, I'll rephrase it for everybody. What's your question?
Okay, so this question is for the fees for the all HOA documents paid by sellers usually.
So the question is, if it's a statutory required documents, who pays the fees? Always the seller, never the buyer. If it's required by statute. All of these are required by statute. Always the seller will pay it. Okay? Buyer never have to pay it. In fact, if you read the car form, you don't even have a choice. It says seller pays.
So I had the situation when I actually asked the HOA documents to be nice, and then when we've been in the contract, they say we're going to get them to you later, but there's like already like fast time. They do it like I think not in a day, but further, right? And then what if you find out in the middle of your transaction that it's not rentable, right?
Then you just cancel.
Are they obliged to give the CCNRs and all the documents in a certain period of time when you're in contract?
Within 10 calendar days after you make the request. Remember, they have no obligation to give you anything unless you make a request. All of these documents, even though required by statute, you have to request for them. If you do not make the request, they don't have to give you anything. Okay? Remember, send in the request. Maybe you did not send in the request. That's why they didn't give it to you. Okay? All right, so that's HOA 2, right? Now let's go to HOA 3. Now at the bottom of it, you got HOA with the signature and the title of the person who provided it. And then you just have the seller confirming the HOA documents. Now, if the seller provided documents, then the seller needs to sign it. Okay, but if it's all by the HOA, then the seller doesn't have to sign it. Because this one talked about DP. DP stands for directly provided. And then the buyer will just simply sign here acknowledging receipt of the documents. Okay? All right, last form, which is the HOA 3, okay? So we're going to go to HOA 3. HOA 3 means these are documents that are not required by law, but may be required by the buyer. For instance, pending anticipated claims or litigation by or against HOA. There is nothing in law that requires the HOA to provide this information to the buyer. However, a buyer may make a request to the HOA to provide these documents. If you are a buyer, would you be interested to find out if there's a lawsuit against the HOA? You might be, because that may affect your HOA dues in the future. If there is a lawsuit, more money is needed to fund the lawsuit, it will be under special assessment. There's no fun being hit with the special assessment, I tell you that. Okay? I hate it whenever they assess you with a special assessment. And you're like helpless. You can't do anything. You can't challenge, anything. It is what it is. Okay? Number of designated parking spaces. Again, documents like that is not required by law, but you may ask for it. Location of parking spaces, number of designated storage spaces, location of storage spaces, name of contact information of other HOAs governing the property. Sometimes you want to know if there are other HOA that may also govern the same property. Now, sometimes you may come across properties that is governed by more than one HOA. So if you want to know if there's more than one HOA that governs this property, you can certainly get this from this HOA here that you know. Private transfer fees and or taxes information, pet restriction, smoking restriction. Certainly if you have pet, you can read from the CC&R whether they restrict pets or not. Or you can ask them to give you documents relating to pet restriction. Smoking restriction, any other document required by law. Chances are you will not use to HOA, you will not need to use HOA 3 because most of the time both buyers are not that sophisticated. In fact, they don't even care. If you don't care, they don't care. Okay? Because frankly, the most important is actually HOA 2. Okay? All right. That's pretty much sums up what we're going to cover for HOA. Okay? All right. See you guys next week.